Star Trek has been a franchise that depicts a certain future for humanity, a united Earth that is part of a larger federation of over 100 member worlds as an interstellar society. This of course means it is important to futurism, both when it is wrong and when it is right. While some of the futurism in Star Trek is obviously unrealistic, such as that alien races look like humans and even more unrealistically, can all interbreed with each other, this of course has to bend to the realities of television ratings for the audience of each episode's time. In fact, the original Star Trek series was ahead of its time to such an extent that it was cancelled for low ratings, only to be the origin of a huge franchise that became more successful decades later as the television viewing general public caught up to science fiction as a genre. But there are times where the Star Trek franchise had to estimate future technology in relation to the production era of a particular episode or film. And thus, there were times when this turned out to be a very good prediction, and there were times when the prediction was very inaccurate. Bear in mind that in general, Star Trek has to underestimate technological progress because something too advanced for the audience would make the situation too hard for viewers to relate to. Remember that the original Star Trek series was meant to take place 300 years after the viewer's time, so the first episode in 1966 was set in 2266. The subsequent spin-offs set in the 24th century, of which there were 3, were thus meant to take place 378 years after the viewer's time. This delta continued to be true even for the recent conclusion of the Star Trek Picard series. So we can move on to some examples as per this table here. There are many examples to choose from, but there are 3 in particular that are illustrative. First we go to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. This was a feature film in 1991, at a time when people still used paper flip charts for presentations. When you add the special effect limitations of the time, that explains why we still see this being used in a setting meant to be in 2293. We hardly ever see paper flip charts used even in 2023 anymore, but we are to believe this is how presentations are done at the topmost levels of government of an interstellar federation in the year 2293. They have transporters and can travel at many times the speed of light, but they use paper flip charts for presentations. Next we go to a famous and complicated episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine titled Trials and Tribulations, which was first released to the audience in 1996. The characters, set in 2373, have to travel back in time to the events of an earlier Star Trek episode titled The Trouble with Tribbles to fix some aspect of the timeline. The old episode aired in 1967 and was set in 2268, but the characters from Deep Space Nine have to go 95 years into their past to be in an episode that was aired 29 years earlier from the viewer's perspective. Now, if you're any type of Star Trek fan, this episode is something you're already very familiar with, but if not, this is confusing and the table may be of assistance. This episode was hailed as groundbreaking television since the 1996 actors were inserted into the 1967 footage in a manner that was very seamless, and it was easy to suspend disbelief. It was a watershed moment for special effects in television. I don't know why they didn't do this in more Star Trek episodes across the franchise, as the opportunities to create other great content are many. But consider how primitive the technology of even the 2268 setting is, because it has to cater to the 1967 audience.
I want to know who started it. I'm waiting. Chekhov. I know you. You started it, didn't you?
No, sir, I didn't.
Well, who did?
I don't know, sir.
I want to know who threw the first punch. All right, you're all confined to quarters until I find out who started it. Dismissed. Scotty, not you.
The bar brawl did not have a single person with a smartphone, so that Captain Kirk could easily see video footage of who threw the first punch, which he had to interrogate an entire line of his officers to investigate. Plus, since the people from the future were involved in the bar brawl, any video footage would surely disrupt the timeline far more than a setting with no video footage, and thus no evidence of visits from these unknown people with no identification. If only people in 2268 had something as advanced as smartphones, so that all the bystanders who naturally would have recorded video of the brawl, since that is what happens today, could have footage, they could submit this footage to the authorities. Similarly, it is inconceivable that the bridge of the Enterprise would not have a camera operating on it at all times to record what happens on the bridge, since that exists even in bank branches and at the doorsteps of many well-off people's homes today. But there is no way Benjamin Sisko could have interacted with James T. Kirk without disrupting the timeline if there was a bridge camera in operation. So cameras in the hands of everyone, as we have today in 2023, was far, far too advanced for 2268 apparently. And the 2373 characters going back in time were aware of that, which is the only way they could risk going back in time and have all the interactions that they did, because there is no video footage of them ever having been at that place and time in the past. Now back to the table. We proceed to a TV episode, The Measure of a Man, which is another example of what Star Trek does best, which is to combine genres. This was science fiction and courtroom drama combined as one, and this episode became very famous as well. But in this episode, one segment is of particular interest for our purposes. The android, Commander Data, who is so unique that the best robotics people in the vast Federation are unable to create others like him, no matter how many resources they have at their disposal or how many people work on the project. The only others like him at that point were created by his creator. He is required to give some of his technical specifications to the court record. As this was 1989 in terms of viewer time, most people had desktop PCs that were very primitive by today's standards, and there were no laptops and smartphones. So we can see his specifications.
Commander, what is the capacity of your memory, and how fast can you access information?
I have an ultimate storage capacity of 800 quadrillion bits. My total linear computational speed has been rated at 60 trillion operations per second.
The question was about memory, and he responded with storage. Fine. But he did say that he has only 89 petabytes of storage. From a 2023 perspective, that is not much. His processing power of 60 trillion floating point operations per second is also not much, and is less than many enterprise-grade machines today. A PlayStation 5 of today can do 12 teraflops, so Data only has as much processing power as 5 of today's PlayStation 5s. Of course, Data does not need to be plugged in, has all of his computing hardware within his human-like form factor, and was constructed to look human, so perhaps he should be compared to a smartphone with more stringent energy and ergonomic considerations than to a desktop PC. But still, his storage and processing power is no more than what consumers will be able to purchase in a desktop PC in the 2030s, or at the latest by the early 2040s. Since this episode is set all the way in 2365, this is a massive undershoot of computational power progression, even under just standard Moore's law speeds. It may have seemed like a lot back in 1989, but even in 2023, this is an underwhelming estimation of computing progression to take place over the next 370 plus years. Remember that under the accelerating rate of change, 2373 may differ from 2023, let alone 1989, by the same magnitude that 2023 differs from 4000 BC, let's say. I mean, we expect a technological singularity by the 2060s, well within the lifetimes of some of you watching this. The writers of this episode had to work within a reality that computational parameters billions of times more advanced than what a 1989 audience is accustomed to is already going to be too much, even if those of us today in 2023 can take note of how much of an undershoot this is just on existing trends. So this is an incredible example of how much Star Trek had to underestimate the rate of technological progress just to fit within the parameters of making an episode successful. There are many other examples of technological undershoots in Star Trek, as well as instances where they got predictions about the early 21st century quite correct. That and more is what we will examine in part 2 of this video. Technological singularity. Elon Musk, Tesla, inflation, Ray Kurzweil, Federal Reserve, inflation, hyperinflation, artificial intelligence, AI, Elon Musk, Tesla, Ray Kurzweil, technological singularity, universal basic income, technological disruption.